where it's just a student crew, is to get you students here to speak to your professors and to raise interesting conversation or more profundity on architecture. Right now, we are missing a couple of members because they're on a site visit, but today we have myself, Aquaria Dixon, as the webmaster. This is Rebecca Barnes, and she is going to be our moderator for the night. And this is Hennepin Park, and she will be our person with the gun, getting you people with your questions. Yeah. The microphone, okay. So the goal, or our series, this series is on the Vitruvian Triad, the first of which on beauty, or Venustas. Our reasoning behind this was to get all students who are learning from first to fifth or sixth year in architecture to truly understand what architecture is and why they are doing what they do. Our idea on beauty, or Venustas, was to understand aesthetics and our own perception of it, and how man can start to go with architecture. Excuse me, sorry. Something liquid. Our goal as architects is to help perception follow through. I'm going to move slow. So this is beauty, Discourse 1 or 3 on the Vitruvian Triad.
Okay. The first part of the series is beauty. We'll go ahead and read this off. Disregarding the articulation of ornament prior to the modern era, beauty has been widely defined as a quantitative analysis of form and visual forces. Architects must first draw the lines between conception, the design, perception, the spatial occupant, the reality, objective truth, before establishing aesthetic contingent. Without the process, consideration for anyone other than the designer is missed. Architecture cannot save the world, but it can reshape earth through satisfaction of commodity, firmness, and delight. Although universal beauty is not attainable, further physiological and psychological study have brought more depth to the definition of satisfactory aesthetics. By narrowing the specific traits that make humans react, we can pose the question. We are not trying to find an answer to this question. It's more of just, I guess have a dialogue about it. So the question I pose is, or that we pose is, how can the notion of Venustas further expose man's perception ability and his reason for acceptance rejection of an aesthetic? We're going to be focusing on these three theories: the Gestalt theory of expression, Tilson transactional theory, Gibson's ecological theory. We're going to be looking at these collectively as we move through the series. This is the first question I pose to the panelists: is can beauty's definition be limited to corresponding form, experience, and sequence?
Yes.
Short answer, no.
Well, yeah, for me, so now. I mean, the why now. I mean, what is beauty? right? We should start there. And
Define
then
the terms.
defining the terms, it's important here. So can beauty's definition be limited? You already tell me that it's going to be limited to that, but it's not, right? Beauty, it's more than that. So what is it? And even Vitruvian, from the very beginning, doesn't define beauty as this set of things. He allows for an application, an interpretation of more than just a set of parameters to operate by.
Sorry, bouncing off of that, if there are multiple definitions of beauty, and possibly an infinite number, if that's what I'm interpreting from what you said, if beauty is in the eye of the beholder, then why are we here? Why do we have architecture? Why do we have this building? If each perception of beauty is valid. And in a pluralistic society where there's so many paradigms, so many viewpoints, can we come up with a unified theory of beauty? And if so, what is it?
I think I was too categorical when I simply said, no, it cannot. I sort of agree, but if you start with Vitruvian, you would have to try to imagine yourself in his tradition 2,000 years ago. And the definition is mostly down to proportions. And most of it actually oriented towards the appearance of a building, not so much a spatial quality. And when we're looking at today's terms, what we're trying to do is then jumping into that experience, which is more like a 20th century looking at it, because during Vitruvian, all the way to the Renaissance, when we went to the columns and the refinement of columns and so on, the proportion, there were very strict rules. And that set is no longer true today. So if you're basically having a different interpretation, that may be valid to you, but it still has to be good. So there is coming an inherent notion of quality. So you have to add that termination of quality, and then you maybe have 2 or 3 types of architecture. I say the quality of the College of Architecture building is a modern one. And if you made it to my class, you know that I'm not so fondly of that building. At the very same time, you're now seeing buildings built in the tradition of postmodernism, which is echoing the Spanish Renaissance, as we call it here on campus. And it's also not so good in terms of those proportions, but you have very different sets applying to those more recent styles. So when you go back to the definition of beauty, say strictly by Vitruvian terms, not understanding how we are now in the 21st century, I would have to say yes, to agree with Dr. Ellis. So that was determined for Vitruvian in those ways. But you or almost no one, I don't know of any recent building designed in those terms, because the current postmodernism is kind of a superficial historic application of things which satisfies the general public. That was very long.
And I think maybe it doesn't satisfy the general public, it seems, but that's another discussion.
No, I think that I think it does, because when you get high notes from the visitors and the laymen walking through campus and specifically pointing out, oh, that English philosophy building, it's just a good building, right? It appeals to them. While I think the architecture building, way in the tall.
Yeah.
So there clearly, that's why there is a reaction to those buildings, frankly, because it's in a very unfortunate time called brutalism, late modernism, when this building was built. O'Neill Ford is a perfectly capable architect, and I don't think he had any ill or ill meaning with doing this building. It just wasn't that good. Happens to all of us, it's hard.
I actually have a question. So if we're having this conversation on beauty and how corresponding form, experience, and sequence are what beauty's definition is, why is there a disconnect between the architect and the spatial occupant's experience?
Is
Like,
there
we
a
always have a
disconnect?
problem with the things that we apply to buildings, although, you know, like you said, people enjoy them going throughout campus.
But there's a difference though between the perception, or you kind of mention of applique things on a building and that of the actual architecture, an architecture with a capital A. Right? Architects have knowledge. We know what form is, we know what sequence is, we know what experience is and spatial qualities that goes through it. So that's also very much part of the architect of architecture. That's why architects are able to do architecture, because we have that knowledge to interpret those ideas of form, of sequence, of spaces, and that's important. I think going back to what Professor Flipper was saying, putting ourselves on the shoes of Vitruvius is knowing what he knows and seeing it in his way, right? It's the knowledge that we get, and that's where we are different, because we know those things. We are able to interpret beauty through our knowledge. It's not so much perception, it's not so much, walking through campus and seeing a catalog of ornaments just placed in the building, but it's about knowing how those ornaments, knowing how those pieces, parts, starts to articulate, starts to make architecture.
As an architect, as an architect, you can define why you create a beautiful space, but can you start to define how another person would perceive it? Do we have that ability, or do we just have the ability to create space?
I think as a good contemporary architect, you try to listen to what your client, to get a knowledge about your client. And you not necessarily need to tell him how you're going to apply your craft. But I think it's really important that you will know what that purpose is. So there's two different things. A building may appear beautiful, just to go in the term, but it's totally unpractical. So there's two different things. So when you have that client, now that's a give and take. If you go to Vitruvius terms, it's not really about the house, it's all about the temples, and it's about public buildings. And I think there is a formal aspect that people believed in one thing coming from the Greek tradition, and then you look at the Greek temple, you couldn't go as a regular citizen into that temple, you couldn't go into the part, and you had to be looking at it from the outside, and the proportion and the power of it, and belief, well, God somehow resides in there. It's a very different experience. To me, Roman architecture is not spatial at all. Vitruvius' architecture is one exception, which is the Pantheon. But what it means then basically, so when I say Vitruvius is kind of to proportion, but if I say, okay, if O'Neill Ford would have done this building right, he would have to do something with space. Because if you ask me bluntly, it shifts then. So in modernism, the biggest quality they brought about it is space and the articulation of space. And here I see you students, including ourselves, going out to the elevators and not knowing where north or south is. Because we have lacked that perception of space, and you just know that's where the building fails, because you can't go in it yourself. You're going in the darkest moment of the building, you go out. What a terrific thing it would be to look outside each time. To south, east, west, you would know exactly where you are. Nobody would walk in the wrong direction. So you can just see that one of the biggest powerful things we achieved in modernism failed this particular building, because it's a pancake. 10-story, no double spaces except the shop and the library. So I think that changes of beauty change as you go, and I think this is what you need to understand the most, because Vitruvius' beauty is understood different today. And when you look at the drawing that we are basing our communication on, this is an interpretation by Renato, which is done 1400 years plus later. the definition of the Vitruvian man. So you can go and ask him, did Leonardo screwed up? You just don't know. But it is, I googled it, it is the most famous drawing, most popular drawing ever made. It's the Vitruvian man, so. Way too long of an answer, sorry.
But we're able, though, either, whether you're in the Vitruvius time or in the present time, there's some idea, you understand what that is. You know exactly where you stand with that philosophy or with that understanding of even the word beauty. And I think that's where we are at, that's where we need to get. Everybody needs to have some knowledge that defines beauty. Whether that changes over time or not, then, that's inherent of the zeitgeist of that time period.
Well, I think there, at least since Vitruvius to the point of high modernism in the mid-20th century, there was actually an agreement over what constituted beauty in architecture. And those go still back to, actually though, the Renaissance. Vitruvius, when he used the term Venustas, was referring to Venus. Literally, it's the quality of Venus. And with Venus, not only beauty, but eros is included. It's a very emotional response. And it was in the Renaissance with Alberti that he made a distinction between, or rather further defined Venustas to include two qualities. And one was what he called plucritudo. And that meant that there was a harmonious proportions, that beauty could be determined by how well symmetry was maintained, how well hierarchy was expressed, and how well the pieces related to the parts, which related to the whole. So that geometrically and perceptively, there was an agreement and harmony within the composition. And the other part was what he called ornamentum, which is roughly now translated, we would say ornament, because it's such a clear derivation of the word, but it's what he called or described as an auxiliary brightness. That other part of Venustas. So it was Alberti who really defined Vitruvius further, and it all had to do with harmonious geometries and proportions and symmetries. And that maintained all the way through modernism, and Corbusier himself said he was not departing from that classical tradition, and that he was most concerned with those harmonies of the geometries. And if those were brought together well, then he would, the space would be just as beautiful as the exterior composition would be. So, well into the 20th century, there was this basic agreement that it is putting together of a composition, whether it's in plan, elevation, or section, that there are agreements, and these agreements are geometric and proportional. So I would argue that, yes.
Good point. Which brings us to our next question. Sorry.
I'll finish that point later then, but go ahead.
Well, it kind of goes into this next question.
Okay.
All right. Is beauty deemed inferior due to the way architects perceive aesthetics?
I don't think that aesthetics is really talked about. I don't think beauty is talked about.
How do you measure beauty?
How do you measure beauty?
How do you?
How do I personally measure beauty?
Yes.
Well, there's a point at which when I see that a building is actually using some kind of geometric method by which it's organized, then I can look at it with Venustas in mind. But if I look at Frank Gehry's buildings, like Bilbao, which is a gorgeous building, I become much more subjective in my my evaluation of it. Because I see form, but I don't see it as a regularized geometry. That doesn't mean I don't think it's beautiful. And that's where we then start to that's where I start to have difficulty anyway, justifying what I'm saying is beautiful. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. I have two definitions. So if you build work, I try to understand the work, as I said earlier, in the context of its time. So for Vitruvius, I would apply proportions. For Corbusier, I think his sort of overarching is, as Dr. Ellis said, more than just modern, meaning spatial. So I will apply both. When it comes to you as students and becoming architects, I'm trying to find out who you are, because this will lead to your definition, because there is no longer single truth out there right now. But what it is, if you don't know who you are, you cannot design what you need to design. And therefore, when you have a studio experience, it takes more than a dialogue. I try to find out, well, who is your favorite architect? What do you like to do? And then say, well, I don't want to go copy Frank Gehry. Right? I mean, I'm myself, or copy Himmelblau, or whatever it is. But what it tells me all of a sudden is, who are you? Because once you become yourself, you can only do the way you feel yourself. And it's not defined. There is no single thing. It can be modernism, it can be block architecture, it can be minimalism, it can be all these things. Today, that's what you will become. So there is the educator in me who is trying to find out who you are, because that beauty no longer applies. There is all these styles and movements out there, and I can't put you in a box and say, you need to design postmodern or classicist. That's not my approach. It's a pedagogical approach of trying to find out who you are, because you're the center of the education. So when you're struggling to make this sort of applicable, say, oh well, do I need to be a postmodern architect to succeed? When I was in graduate school, I felt pressure that I need to design deconstructivism, which was with everything leading, and I just tried and I was uncomfortable with it, and then I said, screw it. Because it's more about the process of trying to become myself. You cannot become somebody else. You have to be yourself, and you need to respect these things. It's like a big pot inside yourself. There's this gut feeling, as we say, and you need to try to stir up and try to find out who are you. And even though if it seems odd to your professors, you need to recognize that if you feel you absolutely have to design classicism, you will eventually do that very successful. But many of you maybe already know precisely what they do, and some of you maybe have questions, say, I have no clue. Professor said Discourse, but the truth is I can't give you a straight answer to this in terms of it, because everything is out there today. And if you look at architectural magazine, you see a minimalist architecture, a postmodern, and all they receive AIA awards. And in a way, you all see this as possible avenues today, which would have been impossible to almost before the Beaux-Arts, I would say. Because we no longer believe in one principle today. That's why it's so great that you have many multiple studio professors, because you see different approach. But my first approach for me within your studio would be a pedagogical one rather than an architectural one. Because if you know more about yourself, you're going to become a better architect. It has to be in sync with you and nobody else.
I go back to that idea of knowledge again, knowing, but you don't, I agree with Professor Fulkerger, and also you need to know, I'm going to go historical, but you need to know your history. You need to know Vitruvian as well as you need to know modern, as well as you need to know postmodern, and then you can choose, because then you understand where you stand. Right? And I think, to give an example, and most of you should know it by now. Maison COA and COA Dialogues, right? There are two buildings that, one is COA Dialogues derived from the Maison COA. Yet they're complete, I mean, one was built in the Roman times, the other one was building, there you go. Right, a Roman temple. And then we have COA Dialogues, which is, a modern building in essence.
You have to Google Norman Foster.
Norman
Foster.
But yet, the buildings, if you look at them, they're so different, but he knows his classicist theories. He knows how to apply them. He knows how they work, how they come together. Right? He knows how a classical column, in this case, they're Corinthian columns, Corinthian columns. He knows how those meet, how the proportions of the columns. Right? He knows the parts. He knows how those meet the entablature, and all of that information he knows, he takes into his new building, and he applies them in there. He's not applying that Corinthian column, right? If we look at the English and philosophy, we don't criticize it even more, but there's columns that are just floating around there, right? There's no, in that sense, there's no knowing how those columns work. And that's where your knowledge starts to define beauty, right? Beauty is not necessarily pretty, I like it, it's, makes me happy kind of thing. Beauty is about you knowing in that column it's placed correctly and works the way it's supposed to be, and how that knowledge are able to translate it and apply it into something that you are doing, and knowing that you're doing it correctly. That's where beauty for you starts to happen. When you start to realize these new nuances of buildings and how you can use them for yourself, and how you can translate and transform those ideas into your own. And that's where I think it's short-lived in the sense that, beauty is short-lived in the sense that it happens on each zeitgeist. It happens in time, on the spirit of the time, on the epoch. But at the same time, nowadays, you have the ability to choose, you have the ability to learn, you have the ability to kind of synthesize your own ideas of what those things are, and how you can apply them into your architecture.
I actually have a question about precedent, both diagrammatically and in book form. There is project by Eisen Architects, and this is the diagram. And my question was where comes the break between our own perception, even as architects or laymen, and objective reality? And how can some of the forces, either through context or I guess even just visually, start to break the balance of beauty or what we see perceiving reality?
Which project is this, do you know? We're showing of Eisenman right now.
Is this
This is the
City of Culture?
City of Culture in Spain.
See, I think for Eisenman what's mattering is novelty. If you're thinking with the New York vibes and with sort of a gripping almost there and trying to be very rigorous, and as he progresses, and I think a lot of 20th century architecture has to do with novelty in terms of what you're using and what you're doing first. And I think the application to me when I look at this work of beauty actually comes secondary. I would also argue he knows his history very well. He did a wonderful book on Italian architecture, Casa del Fascio in Milan, and he's deep knowledgeable, but in terms of when he talks about contemporary, that was first on deconstructivist and now working with computers, for him novelty seems to be really the drive. So if you think you could define Eisenman and say he's a deconstructivist architect, he moved already elsewhere. So he's the next and the next and the next. So the novelty for many, especially architects working right now, that's the most drive. And for how I work, I think it's important that you know about this, but for how I work in my architecture, I work a lot slower. I'm not as fast. But that's okay, because I have to be myself and not Eisenman. So what then happens is, I don't think he's that much concerned with the notion of beauty as we try to discuss it. It's more novelty.
Could that be where some of the disconnect between ordinary people and the architectural world is coming from?
Yes, it can be that it means more about the novelty and what he can define and make a landmark building than maybe. Or at the same time, I'm going to give you a nice story. I mean, Eisenman says basically, like there comes a column in one of his houses, 4 or 5, and somehow he couldn't move the dishwasher in the kitchen also, and it was right there at the kitchen table, and then the client tried to say something, well, this doesn't fit me, and said, oh, this is your uninvited guest. Right there at the kitchen table. Well, I'm not sure if I want to put up with uninvited guests, but it makes for a great story. I mean, you have huge egos there, and I think there you need to position yourself where you want to be. I mean, that's one valid option, and I wouldn't discount that. If that is you need to go and push for that direction. It's not me, but it certainly is a moment in architectural history in the 60s where that was important, especially for him. But don't forget, it's not exclusively art to do architecture. It also has to do with what the perception or what the function of the building is going to be. So you will have a client. If you can make architecture as space and are very free to interpret, you should embrace that. That's a great opportunity. But many of us have constraints, and they have to work with those constraints, and they can be actually a good thing.
This will bring us to our next question.
Is the paradoxical nature of beauty caused to discard it from the Vitruvian Triad as architecture's non-entity?
No.
But you said that sometimes novelty is more important than beauty as an architect. And we're making it, maybe beauty doesn't matter, maybe everything practical that we can put together, composition with, if it's sound, could be what works as architects.
So if it just works, would you then say, well, why would you then hire an architect because the engineer can just do this so well? No. I want to go for a moment back to beauty because Dr. Ellis was on to something interesting, and I translated delight, which is the English word for Venustas, and it actually says something also joy and the erotic moment, because it does have a little bit, it's a larger term than beauty, because I think you need to know that this is all encompassing, and I think for our discussion, not that I'm trying to criticize that you bring up beauty, but it's called commodity firmness and delight. And delight, when you look it up, it is really also a synonym for it is joy, and it goes into something more encompassing, it goes also into your perception. So, yeah, you sort of say beauty, and it would be ugly, I think the antitone. So it really has, I think it's a richer term, delight, and I think that's what you're trying to allude to.
And it doesn't stumble over those objective requirements for beauty. Delight is as you said, it is richer and broader than the term.
Yes. You know, if you go back, I think novelty to me is over. I personally believe, I mean, more like the museum camp. I mean, I really can't invent every week a new architecture. I just can't. But actually, Eisenman can. I mean, he's that restless. So obviously, his reputation speaks for him. But nevertheless, there you need to listen. As an educator, I have to tell you about all these ideas, because if I don't, I will be a bad teacher. Because you need to know that these options are out there, but then you need to go inside yourself, do your own homework, and try to find out, what am I interested? And if there is some gut telling you, well, somehow you have a resistance towards UPE or minimalism, then you have that, you better take that serious. You don't actually hurt me in terms of it. You need to become yourself, which is part of education. So that puts you in a specific position, and when Frank Lloyd comes out and pontificate, when I was 6, I played with little toys called Fröbel blocks, and I knew always I want to be an architect, it's like, I never knew that. It was much harder for me to find out. So, that's good for him that he knew so quick what he wanted to be, but for me it was a struggle, and I admit that, and I think out of that perception I teach. So there is, you're becoming, you're adults now, you're big responsibility in terms of how you move forward and define who you are.
So I'd like to call up another precedent. It is the San Francisco Federal Building. In a sense, this building is not very beautiful, but it is delightful for its use of sustainable methods of design through movable louvers on the facade and many other factors. But everyone that lives around the area says that it is an ugly building, and they'd rather not be around the area for that reason.
Oh, but that doesn't define it as an ugly building, though. No, because people don't like it.
Let's just do a quick question. Let's have a hand. How many of you think this is ugly? Raise your hands. How many of you thinks it looks great? Raise your hands. So see, we already have not a consent. That's the difficult part. We don't know exactly how the perception of the public is going to react. To some it is, not beautiful. To others it may be something else.
But to the architects, though, it's not necessarily about having this almost half metal building in the middle of the city, and then you're staring at it. It's like the Eiffel Tower. When the Eiffel Tower was built, people were saying that the best place in Paris was when you were in the Eiffel Tower because you couldn't see it, right? Because everybody hated that building, the Eiffel Tower. Same thing here. It's not the idea about is it beauty, is it beautiful, is it your perception. It's about understanding what the building is doing, understanding how those parts, how those elements, why it has that canopy, how is that unfold, what is it doing for the city. Now it's bringing a public event in there. I think that's a beautiful idea of that building. It's allowing this congregation of the public. It's a federal building. It's a public building. So that's the beauty of it.
I think that's a very important moment right there. I'd like maybe to expand on it and say, this will never be as influential or as important as the Eiffel Tower. I think I already know that now because of my experience. I'm not trying to brag here. But because it doesn't have anything that groundbreaking, so that novel moment actually does matter. And as architects, you take enormous risks. You really don't know until you know. In terms of it, we don't know how the perception truly is going to react of it. But I can tell you one example. Some of you are too young, but a groundbreaking building, I can only think in my lifetime as an architect of Frank Gehry's Bilbao Museum. Mm-hmm. I have never since had a reaction on the entire architectural community. It didn't matter if you opened an Italian, a German, American magazine, Bilbao was on the cover in 1997, it didn't matter what. Nothing since then moved so definitely, and Frank Gehry was a superstar with that. Period. It didn't matter that he did Vitruvian before or Minneapolis, the Weissman before. It was that. And people came almost out in 90% agreement that this is important, except Paul Foster. That's another story. But it's important that you realize that the majority, and he waited literally up until almost 50 years of age that he could build, came out and did that. I imagine it was similar when Ronchamp was built. You know, that, I mean, when you go historically and look at that. So these moments are very, very rare. When so many come out in agreement of that, but even then you will always have to have a dispute. But when you look actually at Frank Gehry, the way he talks is very, very humble. But you can just sense he cannot do otherwise, because he tells the story that when he took this class of the sculpture and the teacher failed him. And then he was just mad at him and took it again. And he made an A. So, I mean, there are things, when you go into that, then there's things, it's important things which he respected about himself. He couldn't be a modernist and put another box over top of each other.
Can I ask a question?
Go for it.
So one of the things that is very curious to me that all of the conversation spins around is the relationship between beauty as a definition and culture. How does culture make beauty? And when you think about it in terms of degradation of the design of the tennis shoe or the toilet or the automobile, but particularly with architecture, for me it's an interesting question of how do we cultivate a cultural definition and existence for striving to be. There's also, just look at the built environment, how much not so fantastic, not so aspirational things are out there. Our tolerance for non-beautiful things is tremendous. And as a discipline, how do we cultivate an aspiration towards beauty? To me, that's, if there's any ephemera, I don't find it in the definition of beauty, I find it in the way we collectively share that. So is it possible to talk a little bit about the relation of culture to beauty? Say no.
Well, in what way? The relationship of culture to beauty, and that culture is defining beauty, or what's beautiful? Or
how do we cultivate a sense that beauty matters in the built environment, in architecture? And I mean, the example of the Morphosis building versus Bilbao is kind of classic. It's about perception and about reacting to the perception of the thing, and how that is internalized across the culture.
I think in a democratic society, the definition or how a culture influences ideas of beauty is much more problematic than in societies that are not democratic, where culture is not something top down, but bottom up. And I'm not saying that in the United States culture is from the bottom up. We have two kinds of culture, of course. What we could term the popular culture, and then we have the traditional high culture. And I think in architecture, though, is one of those places where high culture still dominates architecture. And popular culture, or the popular imagination, rejects a lot of it, finds it inscrutable and hard to understand, if not impossible to understand. That's why we have such positive response to buildings like the English philosophy building, because those are familiar forms and people recognize it and they see a continuity. And what they want, even now, more than anything in this postmodern world, is a sense of continuity and rootedness. So I think the public is open to modern or contemporary architecture, but I don't think architects do a very good job of trying to respond or educate the public. And part of that is because I don't think architects do a very good job of having dialogues like this. You know, what is, and at what point do we have discussions about beauty or delight? And what the distinction between beauty and delight might be. So bringing that, a more sensitive understanding of beauty to the culture, I think is something we ought to discuss with the NAB. Because once you've fulfilled all their criteria, there's not a lot of place to discuss this.
Or be delightful. Or be delightful.
Or be, yeah, well, certainly after going through the NAB, nobody's delighted, but I think that's a serious failing in architectural education. The pressure is to contract the term of education, or rather the length of education. Most of that is because of the expense now, which the state has pushed off onto what they call the consumer instead of the student. So because it costs you more, you want to spend less time in school, and that's natural. When back in the old days, when I went to school, the state funded colleges, so you were encouraged to stay in school and learn as much as you wanted to, at least. So now that we have this contraction of the actual educational experience, we have less time to really question and interrogate, issues like beauty, which is a very important aspect of architecture. And yet we never really talk about that. I don't think I answered your question fully, but
I may try to give a little bit of an answer also in terms of when you bring back those buildings with Bilbao and what is it, the San Francisco library?
It's the San Francisco Federal.
Federal, okay. So say if this is a sustainable idea, maybe there is the sustainable component is the beautiful wall for the designer today. You know, those two things I'm particularly at home, really fun, personally, if I talk to me about personally. However, I have to recognize, especially Bilbao, as something was unilateral approved. I mean, I haven't seen that many people standing behind it. Now, think about just materiality-wise. Put yourself for a second into that. So we have to say we have to have that, and that's part of our richness, that we have all these ideas parallel at the very same time, and we can live it. So it asks for a certain tolerance. So that's the question, the answer sort of to Chris. But I want you to imagine, go to the beauty term for Vitruvius and his contemporaries. So his choices in material were pretty much brick, marble, and one more time marble, right? He couldn't really think of cladding or concrete or steel. He just couldn't because it wasn't there. So in terms of material selection for his public buildings as building Rome, he was very limited. So therefore, what you're approaching in terms of variety, that you can't compare yourself to that, or even the Renaissance, or even classicism. You just can't. But when you start to build, like you had to use human labor, and human labor somehow are within a certain proportion. And that also added to the building from the moment, from modernism on, you could all of a sudden span, what is this, 60 feet, maybe, no, 45, something like that, this big, with a big gigantic lintel. Now there's no proportions to it, so we know we can have no column in there, but it doesn't look particularly good, does it? Just because we can do this, it doesn't mean it is right. And for Vitruvius, he was a lot more limited, because if you didn't do the right span in marble or in brick, your arch would fall down, you would be down, cooked, out of business. That's not today. Today you have to make so many choices to that, and don't forget, with the Triad, there is also Vermitas and Utilitas. And we don't talk about that, but we also actually try to do these conditions, satisfying those conditions. So just excluding it is kind of a delicate form in itself. So So going back to Chris's question, wrapping it up, I think it really is that it asks us, for us to be tolerant, even though, as I said, I personally can do nothing about Bilbao. But I have a tremendous respect for Frank Gehry, because he's himself. He had to do that.
And on to our third and, oh, sorry.
I have a small question. With coming back to those buildings and coming back to culture and all that, maybe this already got discussed. But what if the Bilbao building by Frank Gehry was in San Francisco and, and vice versa, like the San Francisco building by Morphosis was in Bilbao, would have the same, because we're just talking about the building itself, but what about the context, Bilbao, as far as I know, before that building, it was not even known as much. So my question is it the building itself, or is it the context with the building? What is it? What makes this building be beautiful? Or is it the culture and the people reaction that says this is beautiful, or because if I don't know, for example, me as Mexican, there will be people saying oh, this is beautiful, but then people from China will be saying, no, this is not beautiful. So my question again is it the building itself, the context, is it the culture? What is it with that decision?
I wrote here, first of all, to the latter part of your question, beauty changes through time. And you just pointed it out, it also is depending on culture. If you can Google for a second, Weissman, Minneapolis, and then Guggenheim, Bilbao, and show those two buildings. The short answer is yes, it would have worked, but Bilbao was perfect because the Guggenheim Museum as a client had always a tradition in hiring architects who were doing modern things. But Frank Gehry, I consider as much good he is in space, but he's basically a formalistic architecture, so his prime thing is form. So that's what he brought first, and I think it would have almost worked if all these things come together, as long there would be a water, because it's basically a fish, everything he does is a fish, simplifying it. So it could even work contextual, but if you see this building and then look at Bilbao, there's very close things. This building never had that. One is the materiality. It's stainless steel in Minneapolis, and it's titanium in Bilbao. It looks a lot more smooth. But technically, this is really brothers or sisters. You can just tell that. So to me, what you're saying is there's also not many things he could probably react. He probably thinks he done a better building since Bilbao, but many, many things just fell in place of parts you can't control. And that happened to be 1997 with, the EL system he used as computer, many things, but he never had a hit like that since. And also the idea of having this coming out of the 90s where so much money was there. I mean, in terms of the economy, it did really well after mid-1990s, and coming this out right there, it was just perfect. The symphony didn't do it that well, and it basically is in LA, so that in itself, to me, Frank Gehry is a formalistic architecture, and yes, it would work in multiple modern cities, preferably next to a river.
Yes.
But that's about it. They're both are. It's next to the Mississippi right there. It's in St. Paul's, the University of Minnesota, who actually owns that. It's a museum.
Doesn't it, there's one that I always get confused by, I think it's a Disney opera building. Yeah. Yeah.
Didn't say concert hall. This is in LA. That's not near the water.
And I think that's one of Gehry's faults, that he did this and it worked, and he's now just exploited that idea so much that it's got lost. But he worked here because of the time, because of the culture, because of how innovative it was for that period. It was something that everybody supported. He just took that, and for me, when now the build up, for me, it's a bit lesser of importance, because he just tried to take this idea in everything he did, and it takes away at some point. At some point you have to know when.
What about his new museum in Paris?
The Louis Vuitton?
I don't
The
remember its
edition,
name,
yeah.
but it looks very different from his earlier buildings, from the pictures I've seen.
Well, obviously, he's always going to argue it's all different, but from a historical or critic point of view, it is still formalism mainly. And it's not that much changing. He maybe uses, to a larger extent, glass, but it's still non-Euclidean geometry in which he feels comfortable. And that's what he set out to do in his career. And I'm not trying to tell an art psychologist to disagree with me right here, but in terms of that, I truly think for him the form is where he spends most of the time really shaping it up until it has to him that beauty or delight he's looking for.
This looks more like a combination of the planes rather than volumes as you see it at Bilbao, but it all comes together again as an exercise in formalism. And those planes come together to imply the volumes anyway. So it does look different, of course, but part of that's the materiality, and the other part, I think, is the use of planes to suggest volume rather than.
We're going to wrap it up. I have our last question now.
Can recognition of the uncanny reinforce an architect and spatial occupant's definition of Venustas?
See, I struggled with that question and I received it in the sense that when I go back to Venustas, I really see it, and I said it earlier, I don't see Vitruvian architecture or his architecture so much as spatial one. But I understand the thing, so that yes, it is translating proportions, what you do in the plan, and so on and so on, but I think his achievement is really more done as refinement of a facade and an appearance rather than a spatial one, to me. His preoccupation is about proportion heights of the column, the pediment, and the appearance from the exterior. It will be well done from the inside also, but it's not the main driver to me.
I had trouble with the question because I didn't understand what you meant by uncanny. It usually means like unexpected, but unexpected in a very mysterious way, and sometimes even sinister way. So, is there another word that you might substitute for uncanny that would help me? What's
Unnatural.
unnatural?
Yes. That's even trickier.
Yeah, can recognition of the unnatural.
Recognition of the what?
Pardon? Yeah,
Recognition of the unnatural as being what?
yeah.
Recognizing that it exists, or recognizing that it's good, or perceiving that it's good?
Yeah, I'd say a natural proportion. Just dissimilarities in symmetry, breaks of symmetry that you wouldn't see as growth in composition. It would just be disjointed. How does that reinforce an architect's and spatial occupant's definition of beauty or delight?
I think rather than reinforce, it might expand the definition of Venustas. And again, we're back to that tricky question of trying to pin down a definition for beauty. And I would go back with Professor Flukiger to say that the English translation, which isn't that, is that 19th? Yeah, of delight, might make it easier for us to discuss that or answer the question. And in that way, sure. I think that recognition of the unexpected, maybe.
I think sometimes you're just being in the minority when you will look at things. You know, I'm in the minority when it comes to Bilbao, because I never really could understand the brouhaha around it. But however, I respect that so many others did, and my favorite part is the Richard Serra piece, because Richard Serra I like as a sculpture, and this is truly a collaboration. I don't know of any other space of that dimension where it has that, and it really has something truly special. But what I'm trying to say here is, when you're having to respect, because the recipe for today is like when for Vitruvian was clearly measured by proportion, it was kind of easy to say, because we had our discourse about the proportion of the columns in Yannick, and we had the discourse about the 3 forms of columns, and that held up your building. And it's so much more complex today, so you have to just really try to see what's out there as a gigantic palette, and then have to sort of say, well, somehow, I don't know, for whatever reason I like that, and be able to express that and have a discussion maybe even with the professor about that. Because that's delicate. I think that's where we were struggling, because, well, what am I and how do I fit that and how is my building going to be perceived? And this has to do also with the risk-taking part of today. You will not know. I mean, that's a yogiism. You will not know until you know. So in baseball. So when it comes to the fish and the Barcelona thing, is also like I mean that right at that moment he was one of the first who just we were really surprised that he actually could build it. If you start to look at Frank Gehry's museum on Mile and Rhine, it's so tiny, but it was the first, I think 87 or so that was built, and I went there right that year. And it's just almost conventional. It's a white box so it's a little bit crooked, but it has nothing of the elegance of the fish, because it happens for the first time we can build all these so smoothly, so elegant. And the Weissman and the other one, the Bilbao one, showed that it's a lot more progressed. But now it lost already somewhat of its novelty, because he showed and proved that we can do it. So it's maybe because of that Disney isn't as important 10 years later. So show me the question again. I think the unexpected, for you to try to know that when you do a certain proportional thing you will be right, it's not going to work like that recipe thing. It will truly be depending on your give and take, and I think what we don't even talk about it because it's just too large of a scope. I think what the environment, all these things on the environment, I think that really contextual thing that really truly matters. But I think we can't discuss all this, nor can we do the material discussion, because it's just too brief as the time we have here.
But from what I've perceived from this discussion in general, and also just from what I've studied and read, beauty is more related to harmony between various things, the various elements of the building, even if it's very complex. Harmony with its location, with its place in time, and isn't it a little a bit of a reverse to say that beauty would be reinforced by having disjointed buildings?
Well, yeah, I mean, Duchamp ruined all that for us, right? You have a mural on the table and it's art, so, you know, you can no longer go at the perception of harmony. I mean, it's all destroyed. Now, if you're doing this because you can provoke, that's a totally legitimate approach, and I will have to respect that, maybe not mine, but
is that beauty if you're just trying to provoke a reaction?
You try to provoke a reaction, yeah, not necessarily beauty. Yes, it may be not fundamental to some artist or architect. Right, and if that's what I try to say, if there is a sustainable notion and it may be not fit your definition by beauty, but the sustainability is replaced with beauty, then for that architect it is what it is, it's correct.
And also, you know, there's a difference between, not everybody is going to find beauty on everything, right? But as long as you understand that why someone else is understanding the beauty of it on himself, it already has beauty, right? You might not agree with it, you might not say, oh, that's beauty or delightful. But if someone else does and they're able to explain why, just like Duchamp, right? He can talk about a urinal and why that's beautiful and why that's a great piece of art. But some people are just going to see a urinal on the table, right? There's nothing to it but that. The same thing with a building, right? The whole building, I might not like some buildings, but I understand why some of those conditions, some of those actions, some of those moments that the architects went through are beautiful because they explain the process, they explain the reasoning, they explain how the building comes together and how it belongs to its place, it belongs to its culture, it belongs to its time.
Do you mean the building explains all that, or the architect has to explain?
The architect will have to explain it, or the building should inherently have some.
In the end, if it's a build work, the build work has to speak for itself. You can't be there for the rest of your life telling people the great story you thought. Well, when you design that building, I mean, you just can't. The building has to speak for itself if it's a build work of architecture. So you just have to live with that.
Okay, we're gonna kind of wrap things up. Is there any lasting comments or questions from the audience? You guys?
I just want to kind of ask, so beauty in this context is just, it's not necessarily looking good as a building. It can be other things like sustainability, things like that. Is that kind of just what you just said?
In a way, I think sustainability can trump the aspect of beauty for an architect. I'm not saying that's right, but it can be a driver. To me, a building always has to be beautiful, to me personally. But I understand that there are multiple ideas out there because up towards the Renaissance we pursued one ideal. And past the Renaissance, but we were very close to that. So you just have to live with that broad variety that people have different ideas about that. I think also I would immediately tell qualities and aspects of the building I absolutely admire on Frank Gehry and Bilbao. But I could not, it's not my favorite building.
I'm not willing to go that far, but
I mean, I think you have to have a driver for something, right? If sustainability is what you want to hold on to make something beautiful, then go there and make it. But don't be, saying I'm going to make it sustainable for the sake of being sustainable, and then somehow it's going to be beautiful. But it can be, but if you actually go there and you really reinforce that idea. I mean, at the end of the day, any kind of idea that you take forward and you really you hold truth to it. I don't want to talk truth, but you hold true to it. It can be beautiful.
See, if I go to the architecture on campus, I tell you still, in terms of the historic value, I would say the administration building is still one of the very best buildings. And when I have to judge the postmodern architecture on that, it's just not done with care. And to me, they are not beautiful because I have all this knowledge through history, how a column should be, and how a tympanon needs to be shaped and proportioned to each other. And how many different shapes goes in there. It makes me very nervous, just walking by the English philosophy building. And then I come to the administrative building and I read Pestalozzi, I read Michelangelo. I mean, it meant something for those people coming in the 1920s out there and doing this right. And we cannot do that. It's just so superficial. And I personally truly condemn that because it's bad historicism. So when we aspect it from that point of view, which they really need to look up at Vitruvius because they're trying to build in that tradition, but they do it wrong because to satisfy some client out there, that's a mediocre approach.
So basically a building has to have integrity between intent and design.
To me, yes. And I think that's why I respect, very good formulate, that's why I respect Frank Gehry's work.
Any lasting comments?
Just an offhanded, if Texas Tech wants to do historical styles, they should hire architects who are trained in historicism. Yeah, and who have an interest in it and understand it. Get somebody who's educated at Notre Dame. It's got a school of, they teach Beaux-Arts classicism. And yeah, and if that's what you want, then do it right. Don't hire somebody from HKL to thumb through a Vitruvian book and try to put together a building. Yeah. So that's my complaint. And worse than the English philosophy building is that hideous chapel that they built. If there is a place in which God is not found, it's that chapel. God, whatever you conceive of as
I thought it
God.
was a disconnect because from the outside it looks really good, but the inside it's just so
Cold. Cold and ugly.
Yeah, it's like they try to make it completely featureless. There's no detail to it.
Right, it's supposed to be, it's a lecture hall, and not a good one at that. And the exterior isn't very well done. But you'll learn that next semester, why it's not.
And just off of that, to know, it comes down to knowing your everything, your history, your theories, and how you can apply them and how you can take them from that, right? It's not just about reading something and applying it. It's actually learning it and knowing why it worked at the time that it was done and how you can translate it into today. Right? If you know how a column comes together, then how can you apply those ideas today? Because if you're not going to apply it, if you're going to put a Doric column and it's going to look like a Doric column, you better act like a Doric column.
Yes.
Don't make it be, something else. If it is something else, then make it something else. Don't make it that.
And I don't think the Morphosis building is beautiful.
I want to thank the organizer. I think it's great you're doing this and that you're coming up with themes, and I appreciate you invited me, so thank you all.
Yes, thank you very much.
And I thank the panelists for coming out and discussing this with us. Our next dialogue is going to be on October 16th on structure. So y'all come out and see the next dialogue, all right?
Thank you.